now.
Perfect. Thank you, Grace. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye. We are starting now. There might be a few people knocking on the waiting room door as we progress through the next few minutes or so. Welcome, everybody. I'll introduce myself first of all. There are a few familiar faces around the screen that I can see. So my name's Andy Taylor. I'm the head of centres for Woodcraft Folk. So it's my job to line manage the centre managers and the centre coordinators across the sites that we manage. I've got a fairly long history of experience of managing centres and education provisions. I'm a teacher by training, but I've worked in the outdoor education sector for most of my career, and so have a pretty good understanding of what we're about to talk about. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get cracking straight away. I think the first thing that I'd like you to do is just have a bit of paper or something to write on and a pen handy, because we are going to be involving you in some thinking and doing as we move forward through the next 30 or 40 minutes or so. So grab something to write with, grab something to write on, doesn't matter what, but just something so that you can, hang on, let's see if I can. Just trying to get access to the waiting room because I've got somebody knocking. Hold on. No, it looks like everybody's in now, actually. Okay. So what we're going to do is what it says on the screen, which I think is as advertised. So we're going to be talking about risk management specifically for residential experiences. That is going to just touch on safeguarding and child protection issues, but isn't going to focus centrally on safeguarding and child protection issues. There will be chance for specific questions at the end, and I'm always happy to take specific questions, which is why one of the first things that I've shared with you is my email address. So by all means, write that down. It's very simply just andrew.taylor@woodcraft.org.uk. And if you have specific questions around those issues for planning residential visits and camps, then please do get in touch, and I'll do my best to get back to you as quickly as possible. So what are we going to cover? Really, in a nutshell, we'll cover some of the basic concepts of risk management, the minimum expectations of the organisation of Woodcraft Folk, what you're being asked to do as group leaders when you're planning residential experiences, sharing some good practice thinking and some good practice resources, and looking at some other places for accessing support. But bear in mind what I've already said is, which I'm really quite happy to take individual queries and questions via the email address that I've already shared. As I've said already, covering basic concepts means we need to think a little bit about some definitions and some words which are really bandied around with abandon in risk management circles do need to be understood a little bit. So what's a hazard? Really simply, it's something that can cause harm to volunteers or to the children and young people that you're working with. It's as simple as that. And what's a risk? Well, a risk is the likelihood, the probability that hazard actually does cause harm. And it helps to have those simple definitions at the heart of thinking in terms of risk management, because probability and likelihood of harm are central to what we'll look at throughout, really. It's really important, before you're thinking about what the problems are, that you think what the positives are, and that you plan for those positives as effectively and as clearly as possible, and that you include your young people within that. Now, I think as an organisation, Woodcraft Folk are routinely involving young people in planning for work of this nature, activities of this nature, but it's equally important to include young people and children in risk management decision. Risk education is a part of the point of enabling young people to experience some risk. So that's important to start from the positives rather than a list of the problems that you might experience when you're out on your residential experiences. And the benefits of residential work are really well documented. They're really well explored from a research point of view, from a learning point of view, and it's a really powerful thing that we do with young people. So keep that at the heart of thinking, because this is really important. Balancing any risks that we know exist and that we have to manage against those benefits. And risk benefit assessment is something that we'll touch on later on. Basic risk assessment practice is about identifying things that can cause harm, the hazards, and about putting control measures in place to make that risk go away, or to make it more tolerable, or to make it controlled if it happens. So if it happens, there's something in place to make it less bad. This is really important. Lots of people will write a perfect risk assessment, but then it will sit in a file. Sharing is probably the most important lesson of all of what we'll be talking about this evening. The sharing of the process, as we've already talked about, it's not one person who writes a risk assessment and puts it in a file. It's a collaborative process. And as I've said already, it should involve young people and children that you'll be working with as well. But if that then isn't shared once it's complete, those people who need to take action as a result of the risk assessment document won't be able to. Sharing doesn't have to be in a documentary form. You don't have to email everybody with the risk assessments and get them to sign them to say they've read it. But you might, for example, have a meeting prior to a residential where you share the risk assessment in an oral form. That's fine. Which is then how you put it into practice and how you ensure that what you've got in your planning, both positives and negatives, actually happens on the ground. And the last part of this chain is reviewing and ensuring that you learn from things that happen. We'll talk a bit about that and about intervals for reviewing risk assessments as we go through. I'm not going to say much about this except to say that it's a really useful source of information, exploring the idea of risk benefit analysis in an outdoor learning, outdoor education context, and so is possibly familiar to people. Tim Gill comes from a play background, and is he started life as a play worker and then worked up into policy and advisory work beyond there. It's a very useful document, and I'm not going to say any more about it except that Judith Hackett isn't the chair of HSE anymore. She was the chair when this was written. So what do we mean by balancing risks and benefits? The conventional approach to risk assessment is about looking at a working environment generally, maybe an office, maybe a factory, looking at something that could cause harm, like a cable across an office floor that somebody might trip over, and then doing something to remove that hazard, to make it not there anymore. That's largely how conventional risk assessment works. But risk benefit assessment accepts that some risks are necessary and in fact desirable because of the benefits that activity can give us. Camping is a perfect example of that, because if you have a group of young people staying under canvas, by definition, it's not as safe, it's not as secure as staying in a house. There are risks which we are willing to take because we know the benefits that sleeping out in a tent, in a social group, can have for those young people. It's a very common concept in medical spheres. I don't know if we have any medics on the call tonight, but risk-benefit assessment clearly applies to anybody having surgery or taking medication. There's always some disbenefit, and that needs to be weighed up. And with what we're doing, we need to always be aware of those benefits. And the point of doing what we're doing at the heart of our planning to enable us to judge whether the risks that remain are justifiable or not. Okay. So the things that can cause harm, the hazards, can come from a range of different factors affecting a trip. Could be environmental, could be to do with the activities that you're planning. Now that could be educational activity, it could be adventure activity, it could be the transport to and from your residential. It's really important to remember the unplanned time as well. So the time where young people are not engaging in activities that we've planned, but might be playing football or exploring or chatting to friends, because largely that's actually the time when things tend to start to go wrong. Things relating to the nature of the group, which might be to do with medical needs or allergies. It might be to do with their age or their experience. Clearly, taking a group of very young children away is different to taking a group of young adults away. The group's abilities are all relevant, as are their relationships and interactions, either between themselves and the group or with how they're likely to react if they come into contact with groups from outside your group. This is really important, and this means you, in fact, so your needs, your experience, your skills, and we, in including this, include all of the leaders who will be coming with you to assist with the residential. One of the most important things that we will all be doing to manage risk and make the most of the benefits of a residential will be ensuring that the people who are leading that are competent to do it. And events like this will help with that process. But equally so will experience that you may have built up over the work you've done with woodcraft groups in the past or in other spheres of life. And then obviously there are external factors relating to weather, the general public, farm animals, pets, wild animals, ticks, midges, mosquitoes, all those kinds of things add to this picture as well. So that's the sort of areas where hazards can come from. This is now where you're going to need your bit of paper. The first thing that I want you to do is to sketch out really roughly, and I've done it on here, look, that as rough as that, a grid on your bit of paper with 4 columns. We're only going to worry about A and B to start with. But the task is really simply to imagine, and maybe some of you have this planned already, so maybe it isn't imagined. If you have a real trip around the corner, use that example, that's fine. What I want you to do is to list things in column A that you think could cause significant harm to either you or your group or both, and complete column B when you've done that. I'm going to give you just 5 minutes or so to get some things down and then we'll share and we'll come back and we'll see what people have within there. The word significant is underlined for a reason. We'll talk a little bit more about what that might mean in law and what that might mean in terms of the practicalities of writing a risk assessment. But at this stage, all I will say is you don't need to include things that are trivial, and you don't need to include things that are fanciful. So 5 minutes just to scribble down some things that cause significant harm. So just a minute or so to go. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, I'll just stop sharing for a second. We'll come together and just do a little bit of sharing. So, and you can do this by putting a virtual hand up or an actual hand up. Who'd like to start by sharing some of these hazards then? What should we be looking for? Go on, Veronica.
Hypothermia.
Hypothermia. Okay, and the end result of hypothermia is not great, frankly, so a significant hazard. Thank you. Who else? What else would we like to include on our risk assessments? Susan, and then we'll go to Tess.
Campsite we've used a lot is beautiful. It has this lovely river flowing through it, and we had a lot of young people, including toddlers, who were not always well supervised by their over busy parents.
Okay, so the river is the hazard. Drowning is pretty significant. Yeah. The end result is pretty final. Okay, thank you. Tess?
Sorry, trees.
Trees, okay.
Yeah, we had a broken arm falling out of a tree on one camp. It's a lot to do with what you were saying about individual participants' experiences and abilities when you're mixing children together. The person who was watching thought that child looked big enough to climb that tree, but he just wasn't an experienced tree climber, and that's what happened.
Yeah, so that's some really interesting things in there, isn't there? So it's the falling out of the tree that's the hazard. So it's the tree climbing and the falling rather than the tree itself. Right? Yeah. You know, there might be risks associated with trees in very stormy weather, but you're particularly interested in the tree climbing side of that. Okay, and some interesting things coming out. Jonathan. You're muted, Jonathan. Sorry.
I thought you did the unmuting. Road safety around the campsite. I was just thinking about our weekend camps. It's surrounded by some fairly quiet roads, but people tend to drive extremely fast down there. We didn't have an accident, but we had an incident where somebody was probably coming at about 80, 90 miles an hour down the road, and we were trying to cross. Yeah, that one. And then the only other thing I think is other people coming onto the campsite, because it is quite easy to access the site.
Yeah, okay. So general public and hazards associated. It's hard to describe that, isn't it? You know, quite often you see it written as stranger danger or safeguarding risk, or it really is quite hard to put that into words. What is it that we mean? What is the actual danger? But I think we know what you're talking about from that point of view. So we've got a really good list of some fairly significant harms. Anybody else? Yeah, Rebecca.
Hiya, I got I don't know Biblins, so I did it on Cudham, which is I guess similar. Yeah, public straying onto the site is what I wrote, but also lost children, similar, and fire safety. Lost children
and fires. Okay, you get 2 for 1. Okay, and I think you can also put your hand down once you put it up again. Veronica's going to come in with a different one. Go on, Veronica.
Food poisoning.
Yeah. Food safety. Excellent. Kate.
Similar. I was going to say allergic reaction.
Yeah. Allergies, which kind of comes under food safety, but might come into other things as well if it was related to, I don't know, animals or exactly. Okay. Any more? Lots of really good ones there.
Could I broaden the last but one, the food poisoning, to be tummy bugs in general, so that it's not necessarily eating bad food, but it could be an infection that rips like wildfire through the camp. Even if you don't eat the food, you might catch it off somebody else.
Yeah, for sure. So infectious disease is what we're talking about in that, isn't it?
And talking of things culinary, kitchen knives and graters. We've never had to take anybody to hospital, but we've got a large stream of minor cuts and one cut in a child, which was, it wasn't MIU, but it was kind of getting uncomfortably close. And we got quite a number until we sorted out the supervision. and training the adults on how to really make sure the children used implements safely.
Yeah, okay, so equipment of many kinds, not just knives and kitchen equipment, but knives is your example. Okay. And you might look at that and think it's not significant harm in the scale of harm, but then the number of people might make you think that it needs to be included and may need to include that in your risk assessment. Veronica, is that a new hand? And then we'll go to Tess, and then I think we'll wrap up this bit and move on. Go on, Veronica.
Stroke or heart attack, older leaders.
Okay.
Particularly.
So medical conditions,
Yes,
because could be others as well.
could be other things. Yeah.
And clearly, actually, could also be children if you know you have
Yes.
children with particular
Yes.
conditions, you know, epilepsy or others. So yes, important to know who your group are and their issues, problems, and needs. Tess.
I just, sorry, because this happened to us, unfortunately. We had some inappropriate behaviour between children and young people during downtime, and one more innocent girl of the same sort of age was really upset.
Okay.
So again, it's about differences in sort of experience and age and downtime, really, when you can't be watching kids all the time.
Yes, and I guess, you know, I'm trying to sort of summarize broadly as I'm sort of scribbling down, although that's, well, I guess it depends on what type of inappropriate behavior you're talking about. But I guess you're talking about sexualized behavior, which might have some safeguarding or child protection flags waving, but actually behavior management generally, behavior management of the group is one of the key things that we do as leaders, and that's a part of that. Behavior management. Okay, thank you. I'm just going to pop my screen back on now. That's really useful. We are going to come back to those, so keep your bit of paper handy. And okay, so we're back on track. There's lots of academic stuff that you will find about risk management, and it gets to be overly complex and overly complicated. Some of what I'm going to show you now is an example of that, and this has been used in woodcraft training previously. I think it's better to try and get away from that kind of unnecessary complexity. So I'm going to skip a few of or at least go through the next few slides pretty quickly. In that actually this is useful stuff. It means something quite important, but I'm not sure it really helps you to manage groups safely, to have that upside down triangle in your head. This tries to make it to unpack it a little bit, but doesn't really help from that point of view. Really, what we're trying to do are these three things. If you found something that is a hazard that's going to cause harm, we either want to avoid it completely, or we want to make the harm less likely to happen, or we want to make it less bad if it does happen. And that's the kind of three things that you need to bear in mind when you're putting control measures into place, because that's what we're going to be looking at next. Is you've identified some hazards and some issues and problems. We need to think about how to avoid them, how to make harm less likely to happen, or to make the consequences less bad if it does happen. I suppose because we're planning carefully and we're looking at the benefits of what we're doing, there might be some hazards that we can avoid completely, but really, because we're accepting that some risk is positive and beneficial for young people, that we're talking about making harm less likely to happen as a result of those hazards, and making consequences less bad if it does happen. So sometimes avoidance is a part of this picture. Mostly it'll be the other two. Yeah, again, it's easy to stray into overly academic and overly complicated terrain. These quotes are simply saying that it should be simple, and they're not doing it in a very simple way, but they're saying that the process itself shouldn't get in the way of us and the young people we work with experiencing the positively beneficial stuff we do with them. You know, it shouldn't be an excuse to stop things, and the way we approach things shouldn't be done in ways which makes it less likely for you to go on camp with a group, because that's not what we're about at all. So this is where we move on with your bit of paper, your scruffy bit of paper in front of you. We've identified a number of hazards, potential harms. We didn't talk about column B. I think in column B, it's pretty clear that will be leaders and children and young people, or in some cases just children and young people, and possibly in some cases just adults. But that is one of the things that we have to include in a risk assessment, is that who might be harmed. What we want you to do now, and again, I'm going to give you just 5 minutes to do this, which is not entirely what you will do when you're writing a full risk assessment for your residential, but really it shouldn't be taking much longer than the session we have this evening to put that together. What are you going to do to avoid the harms that you've identified, or to make those harms less likely to happen, or to make it less bad if it does happen? So 5 minutes, and we'll come back together and we'll do some sharing after that session. Another minute or so. Okay, so I've stopped the sharing just so that we can come back together and collect some control measures. So what are we going to do about some of those hazards that we've identified? So if you'd like to share, first of all, just remind us which hazard you're talking about, and then suggest some control measures to go into column C. That would be really helpful. I don't know who wants to go first. I can do it in the meanwhile and pick on people if we want to do that. Go on, Veronica.
Well, I suggested hypothermia, so I'll go with that. Make sure people have got the right clothing with them and that they wear it when necessary, and also have those safety blankets to hand always, the metallic ones.
Okay.
Again, we've had to use those several times on hikes and even on a sort of visit to somewhere where a child got very, not even wet, just cold, just very cold.
Yeah, sure. There's a really useful piece of equipment. Well, they come in various different shapes and sizes, but it's called a blizzard bag or a blizzard blanket. Okay. And that's actually foil, but it has a very thin, lightweight insulated layer as
that's
well.
The thing. I carry two of those always.
They're very small, very light.
Yes.
But do more than just the plain foil.
Oh, yeah, right. Okay.
What about overnight and through the night in tents, Veronica?
Yeah, make sure that they are wrapped up warm and that they've got something underneath, some kind of ground cover, basically. And brief them all about keeping warm. Don't get cold, keep warm.
Yeah. Okay. And briefing is a really important control measure for lots and lots of these hazards.
Yes.
How you prepare your group and the equipment that they come with will largely be as a result of that. But then it's about briefing and keeping on top of the group to make sure they know what to do with a roll mat, that they know how to get into a sleeping bag, for example. And then you check that they may have done that, because not all will. Thank you. And with those control measures, do you think your risk of hypothermia is suitably controlled, Veronica?
Yes, but obviously one would keep an eye on the weather. Again, we wrote down storms, but equally it could be, some kind of weather freak. So one would have to reassess at that point. Yeah,
and children have a much greater surface area to mass ratio, so it gets colder more quickly than adults.
Exactly.
Even in summer, it's very wet.
Yes, exactly.
Can be an issue.
Especially little ones, little skinny ones.
Yeah, exactly. And the only thing that I would add to that is something about having appropriate first aid cover. So you've got somebody with a first aid certificate who can.
Well, that's going to cover lots of the stuff that we're talking about, in fact.
Yeah, precisely. So remember those factors that we looked at earlier: leader experience and competence is a big part, just as group briefing is a big part. Okay, who's next? Who's going to share some control measures for their hazards? Jonathan.
I'll do the road safety. So what you said earlier, briefing before you go out on walks or whatever, in small groups of 6 to 10, of no more than 6 to 10 with a responsible adult or young person. Obviously, before you go, have a proper briefing about potential dangers.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else to add to that? Just from the point of view of, I don't know, choosing sites maybe, or?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the site is any more dangerous than anywhere else. But yeah, so, yeah. Sorry, I take your point. Yeah, just not camping appropriately in appropriate sites. Yeah.
And I think there's something which is quite a common question with setting up tented camping, is something about the position of young people's tents and the position of leaders' tents and how they're distributed in order to ensure distribution of supervision effectively.
Right. Yeah.
So that although people will be sleeping at night, you're all leaders of woodcraft camps. You know that you're getting a fairly light sleep and that you will be having one ear open, because that's how it works. And that's one of the control measures, is how we spread supervision through a group for those sorts of.
Oh, so you're talking about the actual strangers coming onto campsite now? Sorry, is that?
Well, so if you have a group of fairly spirited 14-year-olds who decide to get up at 3 a.m. and wander off somewhere.
Yeah, yeah.
And depending where your campsite is, that lane may not have any.
Yeah.
Not always the case.
Okay.
Supervision is, so we're bringing some key themes, aren't we, about briefing, supervision, and about leader competence and experience, which is really helpful. Thank you. I mean, I guess that supervision element is part of the control measure for the stranger danger, or whatever we want to call that general public interacting with your groups inappropriately thing. Okay, what else have we got? Other control measures. Kate, I'm going to take that as a hand up.
Yeah, so I had allergies, an allergic reaction, sorry. So being aware of the needs of the group, if there's anyone with an allergy, having emergency contact details, having being able to contact emergency services if needed, so phone signal,
excellent, yeah,
possible, or some way of contacting someone back at camp, something like that.
Okay, and there's an equipment thing with allergies, often with EpiPens. Do people have a view on, if you're camping for a week, how many EpiPens you ask for, or is it always the same for a residential, regardless of length of residential? What do you think? Okay, Tessa's going to venture an answer.
Well, you're meant to have 2 with you, and you should take someone to hospital if they've had a reaction. So if you've gone to hospital, you'll get some more while you're there if you're coming back to camp. So I think to bring 2 is fine. There are national shortages of EpiPens quite often, so to demand that people bring lots and lots and lots of them when really they don't need them because they're going to be going to hospital anyway in the event seems a bit unfair on the population at large.
No, that's true, but these are our risks to manage. We were camping remotely, so you'd plan to take a group of young people to wild camp in the mountains of Snowdonia. Would that be different, maybe? It might be, and you might choose not, but
I'd be very reluctant to take somebody who's known to have anaphylactic reactions somewhere you can't get an ambulance to. I think that would be a risk too far for me, personally.
Yeah, so my view of that would be that it wouldn't be, but that you would want to ensure that you've got communications where you are, so that actually you can get help, because you can get you can call for that help. If you're in a spot without mobile phone signal and you've got to walk an hour to get signal, that's looking less likely to be suitable, isn't it? DJ's got a hand up.
Hey, when I did my first aid training, they said that people only get issued with 2 of them now, and often they leave 1 at home, and that each one only adds 5 minutes, like time until it kind of runs out and you need the next one. So I guess both in the sense of people might not bring both, and how do you tell people to bring their spare, but also if you're somewhere really remote, that 5 minutes might not actually make that much difference. If you're, you know, a 35-minute drive from a hospital, that should be factored into it as well, or like if there's an air ambulance and stuff like that.
Except they would probably carry adrenaline, of course. So I think if you can get help, you can get further adrenaline. And I think we will butt up against policies and procedures in different health board areas, but broadly speaking, ensuring that there is a spare EpiPen with a young person who needs an EpiPen, I think is reasonable, and that means 2. It doesn't mean a third one. Tess.
I'm a GP, so the policy is that you carry both of them all the time. The second one isn't a spare. The second one is if the first one runs out. So it's not a spare to keep somewhere else like an inhaler. They should both be on you at all times. There is no role for leaving another one at home.
There you go. So that's expected practice, therefore. Thanks, Tess. That's really helpful. Okay. What else have we got? What else are we going to put in place to control these risks that we've identified? DJ, your hand's still up. Does that mean you want to come in or not? No, you take it down. Okay. A really interesting one, because it was relatively low level, was the knives issue. Was that Susan? Susan, what control measures could we have for that?
What we found actually worked was one of our lovely experienced leaders ran a session for everybody, for young people and all the adults. And okay, right, we've got from everything from like a knife like this to like a little plastic thing, and saying, okay, here's my 3-year-old is going to help cook the dinner. Which knife are we going to give the 3-year-old? And obviously the 3-year-old can chop up a banana or a strawberry with a little plastic. That is appropriate. You would not give the 3-year-old the huge, great sharpened thing. But that is okay for some of the older ones if they're properly supervised, and to tell the adults, your job is to watch. It is not to cook, it is to watch and make sure that the board is, the chopping board isn't moving, that nobody's else has got their fingers near it. And it was such a great session. All of those injuries stopped. We didn't get any more after that session was rolled out. Okay. It was really effective. But to make sure that adults know what their job is, they're not there to get the tea on, they're there to enable the young people, and to make sure that they are doing it safely and not chopping, you know, doing some fairly nasty deep cuts that some of them did before the training.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, this is another key theme that we're coming back to, is the fact that a risk assessment and its contents need to be shared. So the people who are working with that young people in a kitchen environment need to know what you've decided those rules are, and the equipment needs to be appropriate for the age of the young people. So key themes: supervision, briefing, sharing risk assessments with all people who need to have it shared with them, equipment suitable for the age of the young people involved. Lots of common themes coming forward. Okay, so I'm just going to go back now into screen share. And we're going to move on. What you got in that very scruffy piece of paper in front of you, it is a risk assessment which is of a format that would fulfill our legal obligations. You would need to have identified all of those significant hazards and suggested control measures for all of them for your group, and it might not be all the ones we've talked about this evening. It's because this document is a record of the risk management process. It's really helpful to know who it is who's filled it in, and because, remembering right back to the start, review of risk assessment documents is a key part of keeping them live and effective and appropriate. It needs to be dated, so we know that when it was done, and therefore when it needs to be reviewed in the future moving forward. Right, let's get cracking. The format that I've suggested for you, sort of 4-column format, it is really simple, really easy to share with people, really easy for people to understand. The current government endorsed advice for school activity of this nature includes, it doesn't specify a format at all. And the format, as long as it's understandable and shareable, doesn't matter. we'll talk about some detailed formats in a minute, which I don't like, but if you do, it's fine for you to use those. We're certainly not specifying that. But the current advice for schools is based on a very similar sort of 3 or 4 column format that as you've just drawn out on your piece of paper, or actually an even simpler form, which just takes 2 columns, which is what's the issue, what's the problem, what's the hazard, and what are you going to do about it to avoid it or make it less likely or less bad if it happens. So I think we've covered everything within the slide that's here, except just to re-emphasize that risk assessment, risk management is a collective process when it's done best. It certainly isn't a single person who's the leader sitting in a room and completing a piece of paper, which then gets nowhere beyond that person's folder. It's shared between everybody involved with the group and those young people, as we've said before. There are, though, 3 different types of risk assessment to consider. Effectively, what we've just produced is the first one of these, which is a generic risk assessment based on a camping or residential experience, which could almost be anywhere. And it's fine for you to keep a group camp risk assessment, which covers generic risks, can be done in advance, can be kept and used year on year as long as you're reviewing it, probably annually, or if things happen that you need to include on a reviewed version of the risk assessment. So you have an accident or an incident or a near miss, for example, it might make you change that document. It does need to be written down. It needs to be written down because we're an organisation that employs more than 5 people, and that's what the law says. We can't escape that fact. And those generic risk assessments won't include the very specific things about your group. So they won't include the young person in your group with a serious allergy, for example. They won't include specifics about the actual camping pitch you've been allocated at Biblins, which is right next to the footpath, which has frequent members of the general public walking past. So there is a need for a site-specific, a visit-specific risk assessment, which may only have 1 or 2 extra hazards on it. It may be just a very small document which adds to what you've identified within a generic risk assessment. Now that also needs to be written down, and of course it also therefore needs to be shared as well. The one that's very easily forgotten, because this can't be written down, but it's equally important as the other 2, it is the process of ongoing dynamic risk assessment, which as group leaders you will be doing every night you manage a group, wherever you have your group sessions, and will be doing throughout your residentials and camps, because that's your role as the group leader. So it's how you respond to those unexpected events, such as an unexpected change in weather, or somebody drunkenly staggering through your camp at 3 a.m, or when your group stumble across a wasp nest in their walk around the site. Those kinds of things aren't reasonable to foresee, but you will have to manage. And the way that those risks are controlled and managed is through ensuring good briefing for leaders, ensuring you're selecting leaders to accompany your visit who have the necessary competence within the group to make judgments of those natures, to ensure that children, young people, and your leaders and volunteers are kept safe in those contexts as well. So you'll very often, I'm going to go to the next, you'll very often see risk assessments of this nature, which have color coding or little multiplication tables within them to give you an assessment of how likely something is, how bad it would be, and therefore to give you an overall risk rating, and that then those numbers are redone again following your control measures. Now, and this is a very common format, and it's the format that's very often used in accredited courses like IOSH, the Institute of Occupational Safety Management. They recommend formats like this. You might like formats like this, as I said before, and I think it's fine if you do, and if everybody in your group, all your leaders and people who need this risk assessment are happy with that. My view is that actually it gets in the way of understanding what the hazard is and what you're going to do about it. So we don't really gain much from having the numbers in these columns. Quite often there's an attempt to give some sort of objective nature to those numbers. So there's a little table which explains what you mean by a number 1 and a number 2 and a number 3, etc. But even so, there's a tendency for people to see those numbers. They quite often get the maths wrong, which is something I see when looking at other people's risk assessments, which is slightly bizarre but true. And it then gives you a sort of false impression of objectivity, which you don't have. Those numbers are entirely subjective. They don't really mean a whole heap, and they just get in the way. So my view of risk assessment formats with that kind of thing on is it looks fancy, it looks like you've done a proper risk assessment, but it doesn't add to the process. It doesn't help to keep people safe from harm, and therefore I would say don't use that format. As I say, if you like that format, if you have a folder full of risk assessments that have that included, that's fine. It really is. But my advice would be to move to a simpler, easier to communicate system. Now, I've talked before about not needing to record trivial or fanciful risks within your risk assessments. So the sort of examples I could give there. If you're managing a farm visit, and I've seen this on farm risk assessments, where children have been collecting eggs from the hen house, and the risk of a hen peck has been included on a risk assessment. Now, hen pecks are trivial, and I wouldn't include a hen peck within a risk assessment. You might have somebody with allergies to hens, but that would be covered somewhere else, and that might, they wouldn't be engaged in that activity if that was the case. But you might include nettle stings on a risk assessment. Unless there's a specific allergy, you don't need to. And that has to involve a judgment. It might involve occasional nicks with a knife while preparing vegetables, but that would be a judgment based on the numbers you were getting through. And if, as we've heard, that becomes more frequent, then control measures might be appropriate. What do we mean by fanciful? Well, the example I give for this is at a time when I was working in a Birmingham City Council outdoor centre in Worcestershire, in a very rural spot, a long way from the nearest neighbours. We were asked for our risk assessment for terrorist attack. Now, in that environment, at that time, the risk of terrorist attack was fanciful, and we didn't have a risk assessment. We didn't have control measures for a terrorist attack. That wouldn't always be the case, and there could be other venues and other settings, and in fact other times may have changed a bit since then, where you might include terrorist attack actually. But there has to be a realistically foreseeable chance of something occurring, and fanciful is a word that's used by the health and safety executive in the document which they use to judge whether to prosecute or not. So trivial and fanciful are the words that health and safety executive are looking for. Yeah, and we don't need to cover those. We're looking for significant hazards. We've talked about the numbers, we've talked about some of the downside of that. We've talked about the importance of review, and we've talked about the importance of that ongoing dynamic risk management, which isn't written down, which is part of your role as leaders of groups. So it's important to keep those in mind. Go back over that horrible risk assessment format. These are the minimum expectations that Owen has shared with me that he wanted including tonight. And so this is what Owen, I'm sure, has shared with you previously in previous trainings have included. You do need to have risk assessment in place, but that's why it's important that we're not overdoing that risk assessment, and that risk assessment needs to cover those significant hazards and not the trivial or fanciful stuff. For normal activities in normal venues, generic risk assessment is fine. You don't need to do a new risk assessment each time you do a repeated activity. You do need to revisit that risk assessment, and particularly if something happens, if you have an incident or an accident. If you're engaging in riskier activities, so adventurous activities would be one of those, you are, as leaders, not insured to undertake those activities yourselves with groups. That's adventurous activities specifically. So I'm not talking about things like bushcraft activity. I'm not talking about working with children and young people around a fire. I'm talking about recognised adventurous activities with a technical skill set qualification framework. Even if you have the correct qualifications, you're not insured to carry those out. So the best way of achieving those things is to engage either a woodcraft folk centre that is insured to carry those out with you, or another provider of those activities, again, who will be covered. If you have something which you feel needs a particular and separate risk assessment because you feel it's, in inverted commas, riskier, then my advice would be to do that risk assessment. Follow your gut instinct, and if you think it's riskier, then it probably is. Every camp, every residential or every trip will need to have, and you can have generic camp risk assessments, but you will need site-specific, visit-specific risk assessments as well. It's highly unlikely that you would find nothing extra to record on that site-specific, visit-specific risk assessment, but it should be as small as possible. It shouldn't be, most of those foreseeable hazards and control measures should be included on your generic. We've talked about sharing. I think I've said that enough for you to have got that message. It's not a process for one person to do. It's a shared collective process, and everybody who needs the information needs to have received that information. And because there are safeguarding and child protection risks associated with residential visits, we'll talk about those very quickly and briefly in a moment. It does need to be consistent with your local safeguarding plan in terms of how you would manage a situation where a disclosure had been made, for example. It shouldn't be different to any other circumstance, but we'll talk about the likelihood of disclosures being made in a residential context in a moment. I think we've covered most of what's on here. Reducing complexity is important, not just because it makes it quicker for you, but because it makes it easier for people to understand. And involving young people, we've talked about. Parental consent is as would adult consent in terms of some activities you may be doing as well. It is a really important thing to ensure that you have, but the reason for including it here is because consent for what you do with your young people on your residential visit needs to be informed consent. So your parents are giving their consent for children to take part in activities which you've shared with them. So you need to have shared your program with parents for them to give informed consent, which means that if you carry out impromptu sessions, so for example, if you were to book a canoeing session at Biblins without having included that in the program, then the consent process that you've gone through, it won't be informed consent. Now, that for legal reasons doesn't put us at risk of prosecution. It puts us at risk of a civil case, a civil claim against us as an organisation. But it is important to bear in mind that consent needs to be informed. Accountability. It is important that there is a named leader, even though this process is collaborative and shared. It is important that we do have somebody within the system within your visit, who is the nominated leader, even though roles will be shared across and shared out. It is important to have that specified. It will be important for decision making should there be an issue or a problem during your visit, but also will give a single point of contact for parents and others whilst you're on your visit. And reviewing, we've talked about. Managing unplanned time is that fifth bullet point down. And we're back to those core themes of those core control measures. Really, supervision can be light touch supervision, it can be remote supervision, but supervision is important for those times. And it is universally the case that all accidents and incidents that occur during a residential visit, they're much more likely to be during that downtime than during supervised activity time. So do bear that in mind. It does need managing. It isn't just free time. Okay. Briefly touching on safeguarding, what we've talked about so far tonight, it is a part of safeguarding. It's a part of keeping young people safe from harm. And we've talked about contact with the general public on campsites and centres, etc. And that leads us into what people tend to think of in terms of safeguarding, which is child protection from abuse. The safeguarding plan that you have will cover child protection and dealing with disclosures of a child protection nature. One of the things that has been shown to be true for generally so, but also for woodcraft folk specifically, is that children and young people are more likely to make a disclosure when away from a home environment on a residential visit. So, and I really hope that you don't have to deal with this, but it is certainly true that being away from a home environment, being with adults in a different context, sometimes away from school as well, it gives children and young people the freedom to make a disclosure that they may not have been able to previously. So it is realistically foreseeable that disclosures happen while you're engaged in residentials with young people. And that's why your safeguarding plan and your planning for your residential visit needs to keep your safeguarding plan at its centre, and that those people on the visit need to know what's within your safeguarding plan to enable any disclosures of abuse or other concerns to be shared and reported following your safeguarding plan. A quick definition of child protection as opposed to safeguarding there. and as it says at the bottom, that and we've had fairly recent disclosures through groups within Woodcraft made in exactly this context. So I think we'll move on from that point of view. If there are concerns that either you or other volunteers within your residential have, then it is always correct that those are shared. Owen is the safeguarding designated senior lead officer, and Debs can fulfill that role as well. I am the deputy to Owen, so when he's away, I'm that cover person. And so it's just about refreshing your memories in terms of how you need to communicate with us if there are safeguarding issues, and making sure that, although we all hope there aren't, that you're ready and able to deal with those should that come through. These slides will be available for you as we, after the recording is saved and you get the link to the recording, the slides will be available with these links on. All of the documents that we've talked about will have come from pretty much one of those sources within there. The single most important on there, from my view, would be the Outdoor Education Advisors Panel National Guidance link, which is the third one down, which includes that information about the simplified format, and includes an even simpler format to the one that I've shared with you. But it's useful to know that where we might assume that schools are being given advice about overbearing risk assessment bureaucracy, actually the government endorsed advice for English schools taking groups out, it is included here, and it is of the simplified nature that I've shared with you this evening. So, questions? Anybody got anything burning right now? And it might be a specific question that I have to take away and come back to you with an answer on. It might be something that I can deal with now. Okay, I'm taking some. Oh, Jonathan. You're muted again.
Oh, sorry, I was struggling to unmute it. Just, you know, the 4-column form that you shared, is that, can we download that, a blank version of that to fill out, or from the Woodcraft website?
No, there isn't. There's a suggested format within the Woodcraft website, which has one column of numbers down the middle, but
Right.
but really, very simply, it's as simple as what you've drawn. So
Right, fine. Okay. Yeah. To be honest,
it's that easy.
okay. No, that's fine. Yeah, it's very simple anyway. Which, yeah, it's great. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and could be, as I say, if you would delve into the National Guidance website, you'll find their simpler 2-column, which is what's the hazard and what are you doing about it. There's a box at the top that says who's going to be harmed, and there's a date on it. But that's literally seen as a suitable approach.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
Tess.
I wondered if anyone could share any tips on managing downtime. What they would put in their managing downtime mitigation section.
Well, for me, my tips would be about briefing and giving clear boundaries, about supervision and sharing supervision between leaders, so that can be done remotely and quietly. My view around leaders and alcohol is one which we do need to keep people sober enough to be able to provide that supervision. And so I would include that within the control measures. And I think it's about planning for positive activity in downtime. So, and I'm sure you will do this anyway, but having the carrier bag of frisbees and rounders bats and whatever else is standard equipment that you can provide to a group. So although it's downtime, there is some structure and there is some planning for that as well. Okay, we've gone a little bit over time-wise, and so I think all I'm going to do is thank you for your time for now, and remind you that if you have specific questions, you have my email address, and by all means use it. I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as possible. If you're choosing sites and centres to visit, and they're not woodcraft sites and centres, which we have control over, then there are some things to look out for which give you a clue as to how those sites are managed in terms of their safety, and looking at things like safeguarding and access to members of the general public, etc. And that's a thing called the Learning Outside the Classroom Quality Badge. So if you look for that, it means their site has been assessed. It means that if there are activities offered on site, that they've been inspected and their risk management processes have been inspected. It means their safeguarding policies have been and practices have been looked at, and it means their vehicles and the management of vehicles have been looked at as well, which isn't an insignificant hazard. Journey to and from places is another place where problems happen. Okay, I'm going to say thank you very much, and please do get in touch if you have questions. Thanks for your time.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you everybody.
Bye bye.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Andy.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.